A white police officer named Derek Martin humiliates a young black man, Jamal Bryant. However, Derek doesn't realize that Jamal is actually his new boss. What does Jamal do once his identity is revealed? Does he let it go, or does he seek revenge for the insult? Let's find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The city was alive with energy, its streets filled with the hum of activity. Skyscrapers towered over the bustling sidewalks, where people of all walks of life hurried about their business. Cars honked as they navigated the congested streets, and the distant sound of a siren echoed through the air. On the surface, everything seemed normal, a typical day in a thriving metropolis. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, there were tensions. Racial and socioeconomic divides ran deep, shaping the lives of those who called this city home. At the heart of these divides was Officer Derek Martin, a veteran of the city's police force. He had been on the job for nearly 20 years, and in that time, he had seen it all, or so he liked to believe. Derek was a man of routine, always patrolling the same neighborhoods, the same streets. He prided himself on knowing every corner, every alley, and every face that crossed his path. He considered himself a protector of the community, but his methods often raised eyebrows. Derek was known for his tough approach, particularly when it came to young black men. He had a reputation for being aggressive, always quick to assume the worst. To him, the streets were filled with potential threats, and he believed it was his job to keep them in check. His colleagues admired his tenacity, though some questioned his tactics. But Derek didn't care about what others thought. He was there to enforce the law, and he did it with a sense of authority that bordered on arrogance. Today, Derek was in his usual zone, cruising through the streets in his patrol car. The sun was high, casting a glare on the windshield as he scanned the sidewalks. It was the kind of day that made people restless, and Derek was on edge, ready for anything. His eyes darted from one person to the next, always watching, always suspicious. He had a gut feeling, and in his line of work, gut feelings meant everything. As he turned a corner, something caught his eye, a sleek, black luxury car moving smoothly down the street. It was a late-model vehicle, shiny and spotless, the kind that turned heads. Derek's eyes narrowed as he focused on the driver, a young black man in his late 20s. The man was well-dressed in a tailored suit, his posture relaxed as he steered the car with confidence. To most, it would have seemed like a picture of success, a young professional on his way to an important meeting. But to Derek, it was a red flag. Jamal Bryant, the man behind the wheel, was indeed on his way to an important meeting. It was his first day as the vice president of corporate affairs at a major corporation, a position he had worked hard to attain. Jamal had always been driven, determined to rise above the challenges that came with being a black man in a predominantly white corporate world. He was confident, educated, and composed, but he had learned the importance of staying humble. Despite his success, Jamal kept a low profile, knowing that not everyone was comfortable with his achievements. As he navigated the city streets, Jamal was focused on the day ahead. He was eager to make a good impression at his new job, to show that he belonged at the top. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that often accompanied him in situations like this. He was aware of how he might be perceived, how a young black man in a luxury car could draw unwanted attention. It was an unfortunate reality, one that Jamal had faced many times before. Derek's suspicion grew as he watched the car. He didn't recognize the man, and that bothered him. In his mind, the car was out of place, and so was its driver. Without a second thought, Derek flipped on his lights and hit the siren. The sound cut through the air, sharp and jarring. Jamal's heart skipped a beat as he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. He took a deep breath, calming himself as he pulled over to the side of the road. The situation was all too familiar to Jamal. He had been pulled over before, often without cause, and each time it was the same. The questions, the suspicion, the thinly veiled hostility. It was something he had come to expect, but that didn't make it any easier. Today, of all days, he hoped it would go smoothly. He didn't want to be late for his first day, and he certainly didn't want to start it with a confrontation. Derek parked behind Jamal's car, taking his time as he got out. He adjusted his belt, making sure his badge was visible, his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. It was a practice motion, one meant to assert dominance. As he approached the car, he looked down at Jamal through the window, his expression hard and unreadable. Jamal rolled down the window, forcing a polite smile. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" Derek ignored the greeting, his eyes scanning the interior of the car before settling on Jamal. "License and registration," he barked, his tone cold. Jamal complied, reaching for his wallet and the glove compartment. He moved deliberately, aware that any sudden motion could be misinterpreted. He handed the documents to Derek, who snatched them without a word. The officer glanced at the license, then back at Jamal. "This your car?" Derek asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Yes, sir," Jamal replied calmly. "Is there a reason you pulled me over?" Derek's eyes narrowed. "I'll ask the questions. What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Jamal resisted the urge to sigh. He had heard this line of questioning before. "I'm on my way to work." "Work, huh? And where exactly do you work?" Derek leaned in slightly, his gaze challenging. Jamal kept his tone steady. "I'm starting a new job today. Actually, Vice President of Corporate Affairs at a company downtown." Derek raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Is that so? And what company would that be?" Jamal could see where this was going, but he maintained his composure. "It's called Horizon Global. You might have heard of it." Derek didn't respond immediately. He had heard of Horizon Global, one of the biggest corporations in the city, but he wasn't about to show it. Instead, he scoffed. "You expect me to believe that? A guy like you in a car like this, working a job like that?" Jamal felt the sting of the words, but refused to show it. He had dealt with men like Derek before, men who judged him by his skin color, who couldn't see past their own biases. But he also knew that arguing would only make things worse. "I'm telling you the truth, officer," Jamal said evenly. "If you run my information, you'll see everything is in order." Derek stared at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with distrust. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his patrol car. Jamal watched him go, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He could feel the tension building inside him, but he knew he had to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help, and it certainly wouldn't change the way Derek saw him. In the patrol car, Derek ran Jamal's information through the system, fully expecting to find something, anything, that would justify his suspicions. But the screen returned nothing out of the ordinary. No warrants, no priors, nothing that would give Derek a reason to escalate the situation. It annoyed him. In his mind, Jamal didn't belong behind the wheel of such an expensive car, didn't fit the profile of someone who worked in a high-powered position. But the computer didn't lie. Frustrated, Derek returned to Jamal's car, handing back the license and registration. "Everything checks out," he said curtly, though there was no hint of apology in his voice. "But I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Jamal blinked, surprised. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Just step out of the car," Derek repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jamal hesitated for a moment, then did as he was told. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. People were beginning to notice, passing by with curious glances. A few even stopped to watch. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Derek motioned for Jamal to stand by the hood of his car. He began to question him more aggressively, asking about his job, his car, and his life in a way that felt more like an interrogation than a routine traffic stop. The questions were invasive, probing, designed to humiliate. "How can you afford a car like this?" Derek asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Jamal kept his tone measured. "I worked hard for it, sir. I've been successful in my career." "Successful, huh? And what kind of success are we talking about?" Derek pressed, his eyes narrowing. "I've worked in corporate finance for several years," Jamal explained, his patience wearing thin. "I've earned my way up to this position." Derek's gaze was piercing, searching for any sign of dishonesty. "I see. And how long have you had this car?" "A few months," Jamal answered, though he knew the questions were pointless. Derek wasn't interested in the truth. He was trying to find something, anything, that would validate his suspicions. The exchange continued, with Derek growing increasingly hostile. He began to speak more harshly, questioning Jamal's integrity, his intentions, and even his right to be in the neighborhood. The tension between them was palpable, drawing the attention of onlookers who had gathered nearby, sensing that something was off. "Do you have any drugs or weapons in the car?" Derek asked, his tone accusatory. "No, officer," Jamal replied firmly. "There's nothing illegal in my car. Mind if I take a look?" Derek's question was less of a request and more of a demand. Jamal knew his rights, knew that he didn't have to consent to a search. But he also knew that refusing could escalate the situation. He was on his way to his first day at a new job, and the last thing he wanted was to end up in handcuffs over a situation that was spiraling out of control. Reluctantly, he nodded. "Go ahead," Jamal said, his voice calm but resolute. Derek didn't waste any time. He began rifling through the car, opening compartments, checking under seats, and peering into every nook and cranny. It was a thorough search, but it was also a demeaning one. Jamal stood by the side of the road, his hands in his pockets, feeling the eyes of the passers-by on him. He knew what they were thinking. Another black man being hassled by the police, another story that would go untold. Minutes passed, and Derek found nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no evidence of any wrongdoing. But he didn't stop. He kept searching, as if unwilling to accept that Jamal was just an ordinary man going about his day. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Derek stepped back from the car, his expression hard. "Looks like you're clean," he muttered, almost as if it pained him to admit it. Jamal exhaled slowly, relieved but not surprised. He had known from the beginning that this was just a fishing expedition, a power play by a man who didn't like the idea of someone like him driving a nice car. But knowing that didn't make the experience any less frustrating, any less humiliating. "Is there anything else, officer?" Jamal asked, his voice polite, but with an edge of steel. Derek looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his options. He could have let it go, could have ended the encounter and moved on. But his pride wouldn't allow it. Instead, he stepped closer to Jamal, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "Listen here, boy," Derek hissed, his words dripping with disdain. "You might think you're something special, driving around in your fancy car, but don't forget where you are. You don't belong here, and you never will." Jamal's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He met Derek's gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I know exactly where I am, officer," he replied evenly. "And I know my rights." Derek's eyes flashed with anger, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked back to his patrol car, leaving Jamal standing by the roadside. The crowd of onlookers began to disperse, murmuring among themselves as they continued on their way. Jamal watched as Derek drove off, the red and blue lights fading into the distance. For a moment, Jamal stood there, taking in the weight of what had just happened. He had been through situations like this before, but it never got easier. The sting of being judged, of being reduced to a stereotype, was something he had grown accustomed to, but it still hurt. But he couldn't let it derail him. Not today. He had a job to do, a new beginning to embrace. Taking a deep breath, Jamal got back into his car. He adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror, straightened his jacket, and checked the time. He was going to be late, but he couldn't afford to let that bother him. He had worked too hard to let someone like Derek ruin his day. As he started the engine and pulled back onto the road, he focused on the task ahead, pushing the encounter to the back of his mind. But even as he drove away, the tension lingered in the air, the memory of Derek's words echoing in his mind. Jamal knew that this wouldn't be the last time he faced someone like Derek. It was a reality he had come to accept, a part of the world he lived in. But that didn't mean he had to accept defeat. He was determined to rise above it, to prove that he was more than the assumptions people made about him. As the city skyline came into view, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just another face in the crowd, another statistic. He was Jamal Bryant, a man who had fought for everything he had achieved, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. The tension from the encounter with Derek still weighed on him, but it also fueled him. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be more challenges to face, more obstacles to overcome. But he was ready. He had faced adversity before, and he would face it again with the same strength and determination that had brought him this far. As he approached the towering building that housed Horizon Global, Jamal allowed himself a small smile. This was his moment, his time to shine, and no matter what anyone said or did, he was going to make the most of it. But as he walked through the doors of his new office, he couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter with Derek was far from over. It was just the beginning of something bigger, something that would challenge him in ways he hadn't yet imagined. And in the back of his mind, he knew that Derek would be a part of that challenge. For now, though, Jamal pushed those thoughts aside. He had a job to do, and he was going to do it well. The city was a complex place, full of contradictions and conflicts, but Jamal was ready to navigate it all. He had worked hard to get here, and he wasn't going to let anyone or anything stand in his way. The day had started with tension, but it would end with triumph. Jamal was determined to make sure of that. Jamal made his way toward the elevators. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by the gleaming, modern interior of the building. The lobby buzzed with energy as employees hurried about, preparing for another busy day. The atmosphere was welcoming, the people professional and courteous. It was clear that Horizon Global was a place where excellence was expected and rewarded. "Good morning, Mr. Bryant," a receptionist said warmly as Jamal approached. "We're so excited to have you here." "Thank you," Jamal replied with a smile. "I'm looking forward to getting started." The receptionist handed him a key card. "This is for your office on the 25th floor. The executive meeting is scheduled to start in about 30 minutes, and I've arranged for someone to show you around before then." "Perfect," Jamal said, taking the key card. "I appreciate it." As Jamal headed toward the elevators, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Despite the rough start to his day, he was here, standing in the lobby of one of the city's most prestigious companies. He had arrived, and nothing could take that away from him. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Derek Martin was enjoying a coffee break with his fellow officers at the precinct. The break room was filled with the usual chatter, stories from the streets, and the camaraderie that came with the job. Derek was in high spirits, his chest puffed out with pride as he recounted the morning's events. "You should have seen the look on his face," Derek said, smirking as he took a sip of his coffee. "This guy was driving a car that probably cost more than my house. You know the type, right? All flash, no substance. Thought he could just cruise around in his fancy suit and expensive car without getting noticed. Well, I made sure to put him in his place." The other officers chuckled, some nodding in agreement. Derek was known for his no-nonsense approach, particularly when it came to dealing with young black men. To him, they were all the same, trouble waiting to happen, and he took pride in being the one to remind them of their place in the world. "What did he do?" one of the officers asked, leaning in with interest. "Nothing, of course," Derek replied with a shrug. "But that's not the point, is it? Sometimes, you got to show them who's in charge. Keep them from getting too comfortable." There was a round of approving nods. The culture in the precinct was one of silent understanding. Derek's methods might be aggressive, but they were tolerated, even respected by some. After all, keeping order was the priority, and in Derek's mind, order meant maintaining the status quo. "I don't care if he was some big-shot executive or whatever," Derek continued. "You step out of line, and you deal with the consequences." His colleagues laughed again, and Derek basked in their approval. For him, the morning had been a success. He had done his job, made his point, and now it was just another day on the force. Little did he know his actions that morning were about to come back to haunt him in a way he never could have imagined. Back at Horizon Global, the anticipation was building. The arrival of the new vice president of corporate affairs was the talk of the office. Although few had met Jamal Bryant in person, his reputation as a sharp, innovative leader had preceded him. Employees whispered excitedly in the hallways, speculating about what changes he might bring to the company. "Have you heard? The new VP's starting today," one employee said to another as they passed by the elevators. "Yeah, I heard he's a real game changer," the other replied. "I wonder what he's like. I guess we'll find out soon enough." There's a big meeting with the entire management team this morning. Jamal, oblivious to the buzz surrounding him, was preparing for the day ahead. After a brief tour of the floor, he settled into his office, taking a moment to appreciate the space. It was modern, sleek, and filled with natural light. His nameplate on the door, Jamal Bryant, Vice President of Corporate Affairs, gleamed in the sunlight. He opened his laptop, reviewing the agenda for the day. His first official act would be to meet with the senior management team, a group of seasoned executives who were responsible for driving the company's strategy. Jamal was eager to make a strong first impression, to show that he was ready to lead. As he prepared for the meeting, Jamal's mind drifted back to the encounter with Officer Martin. He couldn't shake the feeling that their paths would cross again, though he didn't know how or when. For now, he had to focus on the task at hand. Horizon Global was a major player in the city, and Jamal's role here was pivotal. He needed to be sharp, focused, and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. As fate would have it, Officer Derek Martin was about to have a day that would turn his world upside down. Unbeknownst to him, his morning encounter with Jamal Bryant was just the prelude to a much larger story. After returning from his coffee break, Derek was called into the captain's office for an unexpected briefing. "Martin, I need you to head over to Horizon Global for a mandatory sensitivity training session," the captain said, handing him a folder. "It's been ordered by the higher-ups, and you're one of the officers selected to attend." Derek frowned, displeased. "Sensitivity training? What for?" "It's part of the new community outreach initiative," the captain explained. "The city's been under pressure to improve relations between the police and the community. The brass wants us to show that we're taking it seriously." Derek grumbled under his breath, but he knew better than to argue. Orders were orders, and he had to comply, no matter how much he hated the idea. Sensitivity training was a waste of time in his eyes, a bunch of politically correct nonsense that wouldn't change anything. But he had no choice. With a resigned sigh, he grabbed the folder and headed out. Arriving at Horizon Global, Derek's irritation only grew. The building was impressive, a far cry from the gritty precinct where he spent his days. As he entered the lobby, he couldn't help but feel out of place, surrounded by well-dressed professionals and pristine surroundings. "Officer Martin, right this way," a corporate liaison said, guiding him to the elevators. "The training session is on the 25th floor." Derek nodded curtly, following the liaison with a scowl on his face. This was the last place he wanted to be, but he was determined to get it over with as quickly as possible. As the elevator ascended, Derek mentally checked out, thinking about anything other than the nonsense he was about to endure. The doors opened, and Derek stepped into a sleek conference room filled with other officers and corporate executives. He was about to take a seat when something caught his eye, someone familiar standing at the head of the table, looking every bit in charge. It was Jamal Bryant. For a moment, Derek couldn't believe his eyes. The man he had humiliated just hours earlier was now standing before him, commanding the room with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Derek's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him. This wasn't just some random guy he had pulled over. This was the new vice president of corporate affairs, the very man who would be leading the training session. Jamal glanced up and locked eyes with Derek. There was no anger in his expression, no hint of the humiliation he had suffered earlier. Instead, there was a calm confidence, a quiet strength that left Derek speechless. It was a power shift so profound that it left Derek reeling. The air in the boardroom was thick with tension as the training session began. The other officers and executives seated around the table seemed oblivious to the undercurrents between Jamal Bryant and Officer Derek Martin. But for the two men at the center of it, the weight of the morning's events hung heavy in the air. The bright lights of the conference room, reflecting off the polished glass table, did nothing to ease the suffocating atmosphere. Jamal stood at the head of the table, maintaining his professionalism as he addressed the room. His voice was steady, his demeanor composed, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes, a weight in his words that spoke of more than just the business at hand. The memory of his earlier humiliation at the hands of Derek Martin lingered in the back of his mind, but he refused to let it distract him from his purpose. This wasn't about revenge. It was about something much bigger: principle, respect, and change. Officer Martin sat stiffly in his chair, the picture of unease. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a gnawing discomfort that he struggled to conceal. The man he had ridiculed just hours before was now leading a training session on racial sensitivity, a topic that hit far too close to home for Derek's liking. Every time Jamal spoke, every time his gaze swept over Derek, the officer felt a pang of dread, a reminder of just how precarious his situation had become. Derek's mind raced as he tried to process the surreal turn of events. Never in his career had he been in a position like this, facing someone he had wronged, someone who now had the power to influence his future. The irony was almost too much to bear. Derek had always seen himself as untouchable, an enforcer of the law with the authority to shape the world around him. But now, in this room, that authority was slipping through his fingers, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. As Jamal introduced the training session, he made a point of emphasizing the importance of respect and understanding in the workplace and beyond. His words were measured, his tone authoritative, but there was an unmistakable edge to his message. A reminder that the dynamics in this room had shifted, and those shifts carried consequences. Our goal today, Jamal said, his gaze sweeping the room, is to foster a deeper understanding of the communities we serve and to ensure that our actions reflect the values we claim to uphold. Respect, empathy, and equality are not just ideals. They are responsibilities that each of us carries, both in our professional and personal lives. Derek felt his pulse quicken as Jamal's words washed over him. There was no mistaking the subtext. Jamal wasn't just speaking to the room. He was speaking to Derek directly, challenging him in a way that left no room for evasion. Derek tried to maintain his composure, but the knot in his stomach tightened with each passing moment. As the session continued, the tension in the room became almost palpable. The other officers and executives listened attentively, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. For them, this was just another mandatory training, another box to check off their list. But for Derek and Jamal, it was something far more significant, a confrontation that had been building since the moment they first crossed paths. The training session officially began with a detailed presentation on racial sensitivity and community relations. The lights dimmed slightly as a screen lowered from the ceiling, displaying a series of slides that outlined the key points of the program. Jamal took the lead, his voice steady and confident as he guided the room through the material. The purpose of this training, Jamal began, is not just to meet a requirement, but to initiate meaningful change in the way we interact with each other and with the communities we serve. We need to recognize the biases that influence our decisions, understand their impact, and take steps to address them. As Jamal spoke, he moved around the room with a natural ease, engaging the participants in discussion and encouraging them to share their thoughts. His approach was inclusive, yet there was a quiet authority to his presence that demanded attention. He wasn't just lecturing. He was leading, challenging everyone in the room to think critically about their actions and attitudes. Derek sat in silence, his discomfort growing with each passing minute. The content of the training hit uncomfortably close to home, forcing him to confront aspects of himself that he had long ignored. The slides on the screen depicted scenarios that were all too familiar. Situations where unconscious bias led to unfair treatment, where stereotypes shaped decisions in ways that were both subtle and overt. Jamal's voice was calm, yet his words carried a weight that made it impossible for Derek to dismiss them. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that we're immune to bias, Jamal said, his gaze lingering on Derek for a moment longer than necessary. But the truth is, none of us are. Bias exists in all of us, and it's our responsibility to recognize it, challenge it, and work to overcome it. Derek felt his chest tighten. He wanted to argue, to push back against what he was hearing, but he knew better than to speak out of turn. Jamal had him in a corner, and there was no escape. The very ideas Derek had dismissed for so long were now being laid out before him, not as abstract concepts, but as real, tangible issues that affected people's lives, issues that he had a direct hand in perpetuating. The other officers in the room seemed to take the training to heart, nodding along as Jamal spoke, engaging in the discussion with genuine interest. But for Derek, the experience was anything but enlightening. It felt like a spotlight was being shown directly on him, exposing every flaw, every prejudice he had ever harbored. And no matter how much he wanted to look away, he couldn't. Jamal's presentation was thorough, covering everything from the history of systemic racism to the importance of building trust within the community. He spoke with the authority of someone who had lived the experiences he was describing, someone who understood the nuances of the issues at hand. There was no lecturing, no condescension, just a clear, concise message about the need for change. As the session continued, Jamal's words began to cut through Derek's defenses. The officer found himself questioning his own behavior, his own assumptions. He had always prided himself on being tough, on upholding the law without compromise. But now, as he listened to Jamal describe the harm that unchecked bias could cause, he began to wonder if he had been doing more harm than good. The turning point came when Jamal shared a personal story, a story that resonated with everyone in the room, including Derek. He spoke about a time when he had been unfairly targeted by law enforcement, about the fear and humiliation he had felt, and about the long-term impact it had on his life. It was a story that could have easily been dismissed as anecdotal, but in this context, it carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Experiences like these leave a mark, Jamal said quietly, his voice filled with a restrained emotion that caught everyone's attention. They shape the way people see the world, the way they interact with authority, and the way they perceive justice. It's our responsibility to make sure that the marks we leave are positive ones, not scars. The room fell silent. For the first time, Derek felt a pang of guilt, not just for what he had done to Jamal earlier that day, but for all the times he had used his authority to belittle or intimidate others. He had always justified his actions as necessary, as part of the job. But now, faced with the reality of the harm he had caused, those justifications felt hollow. When the training session finally concluded, there was a collective sense of relief in the room. The participants began gathering their materials, ready to move on with their day. But for Derek, there would be no escape, no quick exit. As the others filed out, Jamal approached him, his expression calm but unreadable. "Officer Martin, could you stay behind for a moment?" Jamal asked, his tone polite but firm. Derek's stomach dropped. He had been dreading this moment, but he knew it was inevitable. Nodding stiffly, he remained seated as the last of his colleagues left the room, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The room suddenly felt much smaller, the silence between them heavy and charged. Jamal took a seat across from Derek, folding his hands on the table. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The tension was almost unbearable, each waiting for the other to break the silence. Finally, Jamal leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on Derek with a calm intensity that was impossible to ignore. "Let's talk about this morning," Jamal said quietly, his voice measured. Derek's mouth went dry. He had been dreading this moment, but there was no way to avoid it now. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, trying to find the right words, but nothing came. He felt trapped, cornered by his own actions, with no way out. Jamal continued, his tone still calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "You pulled me over without cause. You questioned my right to drive the car I was in. You demanded unnecessary documentation, and you made comments that were clearly intended to humiliate me. Why?" Derek felt a surge of defensiveness rising within him, but he forced it down. He knew that trying to justify himself would only make things worse. Instead, he swallowed hard and forced himself to meet Jamal's gaze. I thought you were a suspect," he stammered, though even to his own ears, the excuse sounded weak. Jamal didn't flinch. "Did you? Or did you just see a black man in an expensive car and assume he didn't belong there?" Derek opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He had no answer, no defense that could stand up to the truth. He had judged Jamal based on his appearance, and he knew it. The realization was like a punch to the gut, leaving him reeling with shame. Seeing Derek struggle, Jamal pressed on, his tone unwavering. "You're not the first officer to treat me this way, Officer Martin, but I hope you'll be the last. I'm not here to ruin your career or to get back at you for what happened. I'm here to challenge you, to make you see the harm that comes from the kind of behavior you displayed this morning." Derek felt his defenses crumble further with each word. Jamal wasn't yelling, wasn't threatening. He was simply stating facts, laying out the impact of Derek's actions in a way that was impossible to ignore. And that, more than anything, made it hurt all the more. "I know it's not easy to admit when we're wrong," Jamal continued. "But if we don't, nothing changes. The biases we carry, the assumptions we make, they don't just hurt the people we target. They hurt us too. They prevent us from seeing people as they are, from understanding their experiences, from building the kind of world we all want to live in. The room fell silent again, but this time, the silence was different. It wasn't filled with tension or unease. It was filled with the weight of unspoken truths, of realizations that had been a long time coming. Derek felt a lump forming in his throat, his chest tight with emotion. He had spent so many years convincing himself that he was doing the right thing, that his actions were justified. But now, faced with the reality of the harm he had caused, he could no longer hide behind those justifications. "I'm sorry," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible. Jamal nodded slowly, acknowledging the apology without immediately accepting it. "Sorry is a start, but it's not enough. Change has to come from within, Officer Martin. It's not about saying the right words. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one's watching." Derek nodded, his eyes downcast. He knew Jamal was right, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the stirrings of a desire to change. Not because he had been caught, but because he had finally seen the damage he had done. Jamal stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. As he walked toward the door, he paused and turned back to Derek, his expression softening slightly. "We all make mistakes," he said quietly. "What matters is what we do after. I hope you take this as an opportunity to do better." With that, Jamal left the room, leaving Derek alone with his thoughts. The weight of the conversation hung heavy on his shoulders, but there was also a sense of relief, a realization that perhaps this was the wake-up call he had needed. Derek remained seated for a long time, replaying the events of the day in his mind. He thought about the assumptions he had made, the biases he had clung to, the power he had abused. And as he did, he felt a shift within himself, a small, tentative step towards something better, something more just. The confrontation had been painful, but it had also been necessary. Derek knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope, a belief that change was possible if he was willing to put in the work. And so, as he finally stood up and left the boardroom, Derek made a silent promise to himself to be better, to do better, and to never again let his prejudices define his actions. Officer Derek Martin drove home in silence, the usual noise of the city fading into the background as his thoughts consumed him. The events of the day played on a loop in his mind, each scene more unsettling than the last. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the leather, as if holding onto it could somehow keep his world from spinning out of control. The streets blurred past him, familiar yet distant, like a landscape from a forgotten dream. He barely noticed the people walking along the sidewalks, the traffic lights changing colors, or the cars passing by. All he could think about was the boardroom, the training session, and the conversation with Jamal Bryant that had left him reeling. When Derek finally pulled into his driveway, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the suburban neighborhood. He sat in his car for a moment, staring blankly at the house in front of him. It was a modest home, well-kept but unremarkable, the kind of place that didn't draw attention. Inside, his wife and daughter would be waiting, unaware of the turmoil that churned within him. With a heavy sigh, Derek got out of the car and walked slowly to the front door. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open, stepping into the quiet warmth of his home. The smell of dinner cooking greeted him, a familiar and comforting scent, but tonight it did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. "Derek, you're home," his wife, Sarah, called from the kitchen, her voice cheerful. "Dinner's almost ready." He forced a smile as he hung up his coat, trying to shake off the dark cloud that had followed him all the way from the corporate headquarters. "Great, thanks," he replied, his voice strained. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. She frowned when she saw his expression. "Rough day." "You could say that," Derek muttered, avoiding her gaze. He didn't want to talk about it. Not yet, anyway. He needed time to process everything, to figure out how to make sense of the tangled mess of emotions and thoughts that had taken root in his mind. Sarah didn't press him. She knew better than to push when he was in one of these moods. "All right," she said softly. "Dinner will be ready in a few minutes. I'll call you when it's done." "Thanks," Derek said again, grateful for her understanding. He made his way to the living room, collapsing onto the couch with a weary sigh. The house was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the television from the next room. It was a stark contrast to the noise in his head, the cacophony of memories, regrets, and questions that refused to be silenced. As he sat there, staring blankly at the wall, Derek's mind drifted back to the events that had shaped him, the experiences that had molded him into the man he was today. Memories long buried began to resurface, unbidden and unwanted, dragging him back to a time when life was simpler, yet far more complicated. He remembered his childhood, growing up in a small town where everyone knew each other, where the lines between right and wrong were drawn in bold, unforgiving strokes. His father had been a stern man, a strict disciplinarian who believed in the importance of order and respect. Derek had learned early on that there were rules to follow, expectations to meet, and consequences for stepping out of line. But there was more to it than that. Derek's father had also been a police officer, a man who wore the uniform with pride and carried the weight of the badge with unwavering conviction. He had taught Derek that the world was a dangerous place, that there were people who would take advantage of any sign of weakness, who would undermine the law if given the chance. And it was the job of men like them to keep the world in check, to enforce the rules and maintain order, no matter the cost. As Derek grew older, those lessons became ingrained in him, shaping his worldview and guiding his decisions. He followed in his father's footsteps, joining the police force with the same sense of duty and purpose that had driven his father. He believed in the law, in the importance of authority, and in the need to keep society in line. But somewhere along the way, that belief had twisted into something darker, something that had led him down a path he was now beginning to regret. He thought about the countless times he had pulled someone over, questioned them, and judged them based on little more than their appearance. He thought about the people he had intimidated, the fear he had seen in their eyes, the power he had wielded without a second thought. And he thought about Jamal Bryant, the man he had humiliated that morning, the man who had faced him down with calm dignity, who had challenged him to see the world differently. Derek rubbed his hands over his face, trying to push the memories away, but they clung to him like shadows. He had always justified his actions as part of the job, as necessary for maintaining order. But now, for the first time, he was beginning to question those justifications. He was beginning to see the cracks in the foundation of his beliefs, the flaws in the logic that had guided him for so long. He thought about the flash of anger he had felt when he first saw Jamal in that expensive car, the quick judgment he had made, the assumption that a black man driving such a vehicle must be up to no good. He had acted on that assumption without hesitation, without questioning whether it was fair or just or even rational. And in doing so, he had revealed something about himself that he was no longer sure he liked. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless and shaken. He had spent his entire career enforcing the law, but he had never stopped to consider the biases that shaped his actions, the prejudices that colored his perceptions. He had never questioned the power he held or the impact it had on the people he encountered. But now, faced with the truth of his own behavior, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Derek's mind flashed back to his early days on the force, to the older officers who had taken him under their wing, teaching him the ropes. They had been tough, no-nonsense men who believed in doing whatever it took to get the job done. They had taught him to be wary, to be skeptical, to trust his instincts. And while those lessons had served him well in some ways, they had also reinforced the biases he had grown up with, the us versus them mentality that had come to define his approach to policing. He remembered one officer in particular, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Willis, who had been something of a mentor to him. Willis had been a man of few words, but his actions had spoken volumes. He had taught Derek to be tough, to show no weakness, to always be in control. But Willis had also shown Derek how easy it was to dehumanize those on the other side of the badge, to see them as threats rather than people. And over time, Derek had adopted that mindset, had internalized it until it became second nature. But now, sitting alone in his living room, Derek began to see the flaws in that approach. He began to understand that the toughness he had prided himself on, the control he had clung to so fiercely, had come at a cost. It had blinded him to the humanity of others, had made him forget that the people he encountered were more than just suspects, more than just potential threats. They were individuals with their own stories, their own struggles, their own fears. And in failing to see that, he had failed not only them, but himself as well. Derek's thoughts drifted back to Jamal Bryant, to the calm strength in his eyes, the quiet dignity in his voice. He had seen the man as a threat, as someone to be put in his place, without ever considering who he really was or what he stood for. But now, after the day's events, Derek couldn't deny the respect he felt for Jamal, the admiration for the way he had handled himself in the face of such blatant disrespect. Jamal hadn't sought revenge, hadn't used his position of power to punish Derek for his actions. Instead, he had taken the high road, had chosen to educate rather than retaliate, to challenge rather than condemn. And in doing so, he had shown Derek a path forward, a way to break free from the cycle of prejudice and fear that had trapped him for so long. Derek leaned back on the couch, his eyes drifting to the ceiling as the weight of his thoughts pressed down on him. He knew that change wouldn't come easily, that it would take time and effort to undo the patterns of behavior that had defined his career. But for the first time, he was willing to try. He was willing to confront the biases that had shaped his actions, to question the assumptions that had guided his decisions, to see the world through a different lens. The day had been a turning point, a moment of reckoning that had forced Derek to confront the man he had become. And while the journey ahead would be difficult, he knew it was a journey he needed to take, not just for himself, but for the people he served, the community he had sworn to protect. As he sat there, lost in thought, Derek heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see his daughter, Emily, standing in the doorway, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. "Daddy, are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft and concerned. Derek managed a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm okay." Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. "Mommy says dinner's ready." "All right, I'll be right there," Derek replied, his voice gentler now. As Emily turned and skipped back to the kitchen, Derek felt a pang of guilt. He had always prided himself on being a good father, on setting a positive example for his daughter. But now, he wondered if he had been teaching her the wrong lessons, if his actions had been sending a message he hadn't intended. He pushed the thought aside as he stood up, heading toward the kitchen. There would be time to address those concerns later. For now, he needed to focus on the present, on the family that was waiting for him. But as he sat down at the dinner table, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted within him, that the man who had walked through the door that evening was not the same man who had left for work that morning. And perhaps that was a good thing. While Derek wrestled with his thoughts, Jamal Bryant sat on the back porch of his home, a glass of iced tea in hand as he watched the sun dip below the horizon. The day had been long, draining in ways he hadn't expected, but now that it was over, he felt a sense of calm settling over him. The cool evening breeze brushed against his skin, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine from the garden below. Jamal took a sip of his tea, savoring the crisp, refreshing taste. He had always found solace in these quiet moments, away from the noise and chaos of the world, where he could think clearly and reflect on the day's events. And today, there was much to reflect on. The conversation with Derek Martin had been difficult, but necessary. Jamal had seen the conflict in the officer's eyes, the struggle between his ingrained beliefs and the reality of his actions. It had been a small victory, seeing Derek begin to question his own behavior. But Jamal knew that real change would take time. It was a journey, not a destination, and he could only hope that Derek was willing to take that journey. As he sat there, lost in thought, the back door creaked open, and Jamal's wife, Aisha, stepped out onto the porch. She was a striking woman, with deep brown eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the ages and a smile that could light up the darkest room. She carried a plate of cookies, still warm from the oven, and set them down on the small table beside Jamal's chair. "Thought you might want something sweet to go with that tea," Aisha said, her voice soft and melodic. Jamal smiled up at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "You know me too well," he replied, reaching for a cookie. The warmth of it seeped into his fingers, a comforting sensation that contrasted with the coolness of the evening air. Aisha took a seat beside him, folding her hands in her lap as she looked out at the garden. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a peaceful scene, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the day. After a while, Aisha turned to Jamal, her expression gentle but curious. "How did it go today?" she asked. Jamal sighed, leaning back in his chair as he considered his answer. "It was intense," he admitted. "The training session went well enough, but the conversation with Officer Martin afterward, that was something else." Aisha nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Did he listen?" "I think so," Jamal replied, his voice laced with uncertainty. "He was defensive at first, but by the end, I could see that I'd gotten through to him, at least a little. But it's hard to say what will come of it. People don't change overnight." "No, they don't," Aisha agreed. "But sometimes, all it takes is a seed to be planted. The rest is up to them." Jamal smiled at her wisdom, reaching out to take her hand in his. "You always know just what to say." Aisha squeezed his hand gently, her eyes filled with warmth. "That's because I know you, Jamal. I know how much you care, how much you want to make a difference. It's what makes you who you are." Jamal looked down at their intertwined hands, feeling the steady rhythm of her pulse against his skin. "It's not easy," he said quietly. "Being in this position, having this responsibility, it's a lot to carry." "I know," Aisha said softly. "But you don't have to carry it alone. You have me. You have your family, your friends. We're all here for you." Jamal nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude once again. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Aisha." "You'd find a way," she replied with a smile. "But luckily, you don't have to." They lapsed into silence again, but this time, it was a comfortable one, filled with the unspoken understanding that had always existed between them. Jamal knew that he was fortunate, that not everyone had the kind of support system he did. It was one of the reasons he felt such a strong responsibility to use his position for good, to be a voice for those who didn't have one. As the evening grew darker, Jamal found himself reflecting on the challenges of being a black man in a position of power, particularly in a world that still struggled with issues of race and inequality. It was a double-edged sword. On one hand, he had the opportunity to effect real change, to push for justice and equality in ways that others couldn't. But on the other hand, he was constantly under scrutiny, constantly fighting against the stereotypes and biases that sought to undermine him. He thought about the incident with Officer Martin that morning, about the assumptions that had been made, the disrespect he had been shown. It wasn't the first time he had experienced such treatment, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But each time it happened, it served as a reminder of the work that still needed to be done, of the systemic issues that continued to plague society. Jamal knew that change was possible. He had seen it happen, both in his personal life and in his career. But he also knew that change required persistence, dedication, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. It required people to step out of their comfort zones, to challenge their own beliefs and biases, to see the world through the eyes of others. And that was what he hoped to achieve, not just in his role as Vice President of Corporate Affairs, but in every aspect of his life. He wanted to be a catalyst for change, to inspire others to look beyond the surface, to understand the complexities of the issues they faced. It was a daunting task, but one that he felt called to undertake. As Jamal sat there, holding Aisha's hand, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The day had been difficult, but it had also been a reminder of why he did what he did, of the importance of the work he was committed to. And with Aisha by his side, he knew he had the strength to keep going, to keep fighting for the justice and equality that everyone deserved. The stars began to twinkle overhead, their soft light casting a gentle glow over the garden. Jamal took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill his lungs, and then exhaled slowly, feeling the tension of the day begin to melt away. He wasn't naive. He knew that the road ahead would be long and challenging. But he also knew that he wasn't alone, and that knowledge gave him the courage to face whatever came next. As he finished his tea and set the glass aside, Jamal turned to Aisha, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "How about we head inside? I think I could use one of those cookies." Aisha laughed, the sound warm and soothing. "I knew you wouldn't be able to resist." Together, they stood up and walked back into the house, leaving the cool night behind. But even as they stepped inside, Jamal carried with him the lessons of the day, the quiet resolve to keep pushing forward, to keep striving for a better world. And in that moment, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them, head on, with determination, with compassion, and with the unwavering belief that change was not only possible, but inevitable. As the night drew on, both men, Derek and Jamal, found themselves at a crossroads, each grappling with the events of the day in their own way. For Derek, it was a moment of reckoning, a chance to confront the biases that had shaped his actions for so long. For Jamal, it was a reaffirmation of his commitment to justice, a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Their paths had crossed in a way neither had expected, but the encounter had left an indelible mark on both of them. And as they each faced the future, they did so with the knowledge that the turning point had come, not just for them, but for the world they hoped to change. A few days had passed since the tense and unexpected encounter between Jamal Bryant and Officer Derek Martin. Life at the corporate headquarters had resumed its usual rhythm, the hum of business as usual echoing through the polished hallways. For Jamal, however, the recent events remained fresh in his mind. The incident with Officer Martin had stirred up memories, emotions, and thoughts that he hadn't fully processed. It wasn't just about what had happened on the side of that road. It was about something much larger, something systemic, something that couldn't be easily resolved with a single conversation or even a single victory. Jamal had handled the situation with grace, asserting his dignity without resorting to the same level of hostility that had been shown to him. He had every right to be angry, to demand retribution, but instead, he had chosen a path of reflection and measured response. But even so, the confrontation had left its mark. He wondered if Officer Martin had felt any remorse after their conversation, or if the man had simply returned to his old ways, unchanged and unchallenged. It was on one of these ordinary days, as Jamal was buried in the usual tasks of his role, that something unexpected occurred. He was in his office, sitting behind the large mahogany desk that had quickly become a symbol of his authority within the corporation. Papers were spread out before him, financial reports, project proposals, and the like. He had a meeting in an hour, but for now, he was alone, the only sound in the room being the soft ticking of a wall clock and the occasional rustle of papers. The office itself was a reflection of Jamal's style, elegant yet understated, with clean lines, warm colors, and tasteful decor that conveyed both professionalism and a personal touch. Large windows allowed sunlight to pour in, giving the space a bright, airy feel. It was a place where serious work was done, but also a place where important conversations happened, where decisions that could affect hundreds, if not thousands, were made. He was engrossed in reviewing a particularly detailed report when a soft knock at the door pulled him from his focus. It was a quiet, hesitant knock, not the kind of knock he usually heard from his colleagues or assistants. They knew him well enough to be direct. This was different, cautious, almost unsure. "Come in," Jamal called out, expecting it to be one of his team members with a quick question or a minor update. He didn't look up immediately, thinking it was something routine, something that could be dealt with quickly before he returned to his work. The door opened slowly, and the creak of the hinges was the only sound that followed. When Jamal finally did look up, his eyes widened slightly in surprise. Standing in the doorway, looking out of place and unsure of himself, was Officer Derek Martin. The sight of the police officer standing in his office, out of uniform and visibly uncomfortable, was not something Jamal had expected to see. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them was thick with unspoken thoughts, lingering tension, and a shared history that had not yet been resolved. Jamal's gaze was steady, but his mind raced with questions. Why was Martin here? What did he want? Was this an attempt at some kind of confrontation, or was there something else at play? "Mr. Bryant," Martin finally said, his voice breaking the silence. He sounded different than he had during their last encounter. Less assured, less authoritative. There was a noticeable uncertainty in his tone, as if he wasn't quite sure of himself or how he would be received. Jamal's expression remained neutral as he slowly leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. Martin's appearance had changed. Gone was the confident, almost smug demeanor that Jamal had encountered during their first meeting. In its place was a man who seemed burdened, hesitant, and perhaps even a little nervous. He wasn't in uniform today. Instead, he wore a simple button-down shirt and slacks, civilian clothes that seemed to strip away some of the authority he had once wielded so carelessly. "Officer Martin," Jamal replied calmly, the title slipping out almost automatically, even though the man wasn't wearing his badge. "What brings you here?" There was a pause as Martin took a tentative step into the office, his gaze flicking around the room as if trying to find something to anchor himself to. The tension in his posture was evident, his discomfort almost palpable. It was clear that he was struggling with whatever had brought him here, and Jamal could see that this visit was not something Martin had taken lightly. Martin began, but then he faltered, his voice trailing off as he tried to find the right words. He cleared his throat and tried again, this time with more determination. "I came to apologize, Mr. Bryant." The words hung in the air, heavy and sincere. Jamal's eyebrows lifted slightly, the only indication of his surprise. This was not what he had expected. He had prepared himself for a number of possibilities, but an apology from Derek Martin had not been one of them. For a moment, he simply regarded the man standing before him, trying to gauge his sincerity. Martin seemed to sense Jamal's scrutiny and shifted uncomfortably, clearly feeling the weight of the silence. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since that day," Martin continued, his voice quieter now, tinged with something that sounded almost like regret. "About what you said about how I acted, and I realized that I was wrong. The way I treated you, it wasn't right. It was completely wrong, and I'm sorry." There was a raw honesty in Martin's words, a vulnerability that Jamal hadn't expected to see. It was clear that the man standing before him was not the same as the one who had pulled him over on that fateful day. Something had changed, something significant, and Jamal could see that this apology was not just for show. It was genuine, heartfelt, and it carried with it the weight of a man who had been forced to confront his own flaws. Jamal remained silent for a moment longer, letting the words sink in. He could see that Martin was struggling with this, that coming here had taken a great deal of courage. But even so, an apology, while important, was just the beginning. It was what came after the apology that truly mattered. "I appreciate you coming here to say that," Jamal said carefully, his voice steady and measured. He wanted to acknowledge the effort Martin was making, but he also knew that this was not the end of the conversation. "But as I'm sure you know, an apology alone doesn't change anything. What matters are the actions that follow." Martin nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before he looked back up at Jamal. There was a determination in his eyes now, a resolve that hadn't been there before. "I know," he said, his voice firm despite the underlying emotion. "I know that words aren't enough. That's why I'm here. I want to do better. I need to do better. And I'm asking for your help, Mr. Bryant." This admission took Jamal by surprise. He had expected the apology, perhaps even some sort of explanation or excuse, but this was different. This was a man who was not only acknowledging his mistake, but also seeking guidance on how to change. It was a rare thing, and it spoke to a level of introspection that Jamal hadn't anticipated. Jamal leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the desk as he considered the man before him. "Change isn't easy, Officer Martin," he began, his tone serious but not unkind. "It takes time, and it takes a lot of hard work. But the fact that you're here, willing to learn, is a good first step." Martin seemed to relax, just a fraction at those words, a small sigh of relief escaping him. But Jamal wasn't finished. He knew that this was a pivotal moment, one that could either lead to real change or simply end as another empty gesture. "Education is important," Jamal continued, "but it's what you do with that knowledge that really matters. You're in a position of power, Officer Martin. People look to you as an example, whether you realize it or not. That means you have the opportunity to influence others, to change not just how you do your job, but how others see theirs as well." Martin's expression grew thoughtful as he absorbed Jamal's words. He seemed to be truly listening, taking in the gravity of what was being said. I want to be that kind of officer, Martin said quietly, his voice filled with a sincerity that Jamal could not ignore. I want to be someone my daughter can be proud of, someone who makes a positive impact on the community. There was a moment of silence as Jamal considered the officer's words. He could see that Martin was being honest, that this wasn't just an attempt to appease him. But Jamal also knew that promises, no matter how sincere, were meaningless without action. If that's what you want, Jamal said, his voice calm but firm, then start by holding yourself accountable. Challenge the biases you've held, and don't be afraid to call out those same biases in others. Change won't happen overnight, but if you're committed, it will happen. Martin's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if a weight had been lifted. Thank you, Mr. Bryant, he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. I won't let you down. Jamal nodded, his gaze steady. I hope not. But remember, this isn't about not letting me down. It's about doing what's right, for yourself, for your family, and for the community you serve. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two men from different worlds, connected by a shared desire for change. It was a moment of understanding, of mutual respect, and it signaled the beginning of something new. As Martin turned to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at Jamal. If you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me, he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that hadn't been there before. I'll keep that in mind, Jamal replied with a nod. And Officer Martin, I hope this is just the start of something better. With that, Martin left the office, leaving Jamal alone with his thoughts. The encounter had been unexpected, but it had also been encouraging. For the first time since that day, Jamal felt a sense of closure. Not because the situation had been resolved, but because it had opened the door to something more important, the possibility of real change. As he sat back down at his desk, Jamal couldn't help but feel hopeful. The road ahead would be long, and there would undoubtedly be challenges. But with people like Officer Martin willing to confront their mistakes and strive for better, there was reason to believe that progress was possible. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but today had been a reminder that change, however slow, was still within reach. And that was enough to keep Jamal going, to keep him fighting for the justice and equality he knew was possible. Because in the end, it wasn't just about winning battles. It was about changing hearts and minds one step at a time. What would you have done if you were in Jamal's position when Officer Martin came to apologize? If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put in a lot of time and effort crafting these heartfelt narratives, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey.